In October 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union entered one of the most dangerous standoffs of the Cold War, when American reconnaissance planes identified Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. For 13 tense days, both governments balanced military readiness with diplomatic strategy, while the possibility of nuclear war hovered over every decision. As warships moved into the Caribbean and military officials reached their highest state of alert, leaders in Washington and Moscow relied on intelligence assessments and carefully coordinated diplomatic messages to prevent disaster. After the failed US-orchestrated Bay of Pigs invasion the previous year, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev authorized the placement of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles on Cuban soil. He believed that the missiles would defend Fidel Castro's government from future American aggression and restore strategic balance, given the presence of US Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The Soviet R-12 and R-14 missiles, which had ranges of up to 2,000 and 4,500 kilometers respectively, could strike much of the continental United States. Through the placement of nuclear weapons less than 150 kilometers from Florida, the Soviet Union could reduce American reaction time and gain a psychological advantage. For Khrushchev, Cuba appeared to provide both a forward base and a political opportunity to pressure the United States without direct confrontation in Europe. By late July 1962, Soviet cargo ships had begun transporting missile components, launchers, and military personnel to Cuba, which they described as agricultural help and industrial support. Approximately 42,000 Soviet personnel eventually arrived in Cuba, though only a portion of them were part of Operation Anadyr. This deployment included missile troops and specialists who prepared the launch sites. Construction teams then worked to install the missile sites rapidly, often in remote areas that were surrounded by camouflage nets and forest cover. US intelligence analysts had noticed increased activity on the island throughout late September and early October, but they failed to confirm the presence of offensive weapons until the 14th of October, when U-2 reconnaissance aircraft captured clear photographic evidence of Soviet launch sites. That same evening, President John F. Kennedy received a classified briefing and instructed his national security team to meet urgently to discuss possible responses. At the White House, Kennedy formed a high-level advisory group known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, which included Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and senior military chiefs. Over several days, EXCOM debated several possible courses of action. Some favoured an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites, while others proposed a full invasion. Kennedy rejected both options due to the high probability of Soviet casualties and the risk of a direct attack in revenge on American allies. Instead, he opted for a less aggressive but still forceful measure. On the 22nd of October, he delivered a televised address in which he announced the discovery of the missiles and declared a naval quarantine to block further Soviet shipments to Cuba. NATO allies, including French President Charles de Gaulle, were informed shortly beforehand and expressed support for the American decision. Meanwhile, American warships moved into position and began to intercept vessels that approached the island. The US Navy deployed close to 90 ships to enforce the quarantine, and over 300,000 military personnel across multiple branches were placed on heightened alert. Soviet cargo ships, tracked by US surveillance, reduced speed or altered course once they reached the chosen quarantine zone. As tension increased, aerial reconnaissance showed that construction on the missile sites continued, with some sites almost ready to fire. To maintain military pressure, the US Armed Forces moved DEFCON, which is the Defense Readiness Condition, to Level 2, which was the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. This status meant that the military was one step away from nuclear war. Strategic bombers took to the skies in regular airborne shifts, and missile crews received orders to prepare for launch if necessary. Then, on the 27th of October, the crisis grew more dangerous when a US U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SA-2 missile. The pilot was Major Rudolf Anderson, who died instantly. This death caused alarm within EXCOM, since it suggested that Soviet officers on the ground might act independently of political instructions. Although military advisers called for immediate retaliation, Kennedy held back and warned that any strike could trigger a chain reaction across multiple regions. Around the same time, two secret messages arrived from Khrushchev, and each one offered a different way to end the crisis. The first message, delivered on the 26th of October, offered to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. The second message was received on the 27th of October and introduced a new demand that the United States also withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Faced with two different offers, Kennedy and his advisers decided to respond only to the first. To secure Soviet agreement, Robert Kennedy met privately with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and conveyed that the US would remove the Jupiter missiles quietly within a few months. However, he insisted that this aspect of the deal remain secret so that NATO solidarity would not weaken. On the 28th of October, Khrushchev publicly agreed to remove the Soviet missiles and dismantle the launch sites under United Nations inspection, and in exchange the United States officially promised that it would not invade Cuba. Although not included in the public statement, the secret agreement regarding the Jupiter missiles proceeded as planned. By April 1963, the missiles in Turkey had been withdrawn in line with the confidential discussions, although the main phase of the crisis had ended with the Soviet withdrawal in November 1962. Cuban Prime Minister Castro was angered that he had not been consulted and strongly criticized the Soviet withdrawal, and relations between Havana and Moscow cooled in the period after the crisis. After the resolution, both superpowers accepted the need to avoid similar confrontations in the future, and as a result, a direct telephone line between the White House and the Kremlin was installed to allow real-time communication during emergencies. On the 5th of August 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just 13 days long, but it showed the very small gap that separated peace and disaster in a nuclear age. I hope that you have enjoyed learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you would like to know more, be sure to check out the free resources on the History Skills website. I look forward to seeing you again soon on our next video.